Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this evening. My name is May, and as Deirdre has mentioned in her introduction, I was previously attached to NTU here in Singapore with the Department of English, where I taught feminist studies, contemporary women's writing, and also a course on love. So 5 months ago, I resigned from NTU with the intention of migrating to the US. Today, 5 months later, I find myself still here in Singapore, but separated from my children and husband, all of whom are US citizens. So I have yet to receive my migration papers, without which I'm not allowed to enter into the US, not even as a tourist. So I think it's quite ironic and perhaps also quite fitting that here I am giving a paper on migration issues while finding myself in quite a similar but not entirely the same sort of situation as a lot of the migrants that we will be talking about today. So today, I really want to focus, there you go. I would like to focus today on the stories of migrant workers in Singapore, told by them in the poetry and prose that they have written and published in Singapore. Now, those of you who know me, you'll know that I enjoy working with theory and that my presentations tend to lean heavily towards the theoretical. Now, the abstract that I submitted for this presentation suggests as much. I had initially hoped to present a theoretical exposition on how practices of migrant writing can substitute for the absence of, or at least alleviate some of the constraints placed on migrant workers' ability to love here in Singapore. Since then, though, and since speaking to some of the migrant workers and reading their poetry and coming to understand their motivations for writing, I find that now it would be highly inappropriate and disingenuous of me to continue with a theoretical project. So my aim today is really to allow the work and the words of the migrant workers to speak and for us to listen to those words. Now, having said that, though, I do want to share very briefly two thinkers on love whose work has served as a guide for my own reading of the migrant poetry. Now, one of the aspects of love that interests me, that I have always found myself coming back to in my work on love, is its ethical aspect. So how do we live with the other? How do we speak to the other, respond to the other in a way that respects and preserves the uniqueness of the other? Now, as Lucy Irigaray says, how do we give the other a silent space in which to manifest itself? A key element in Irigaray's work on love, and actually all of her work, is the role that language plays in the way that we relate to one another. For Irigaray, being a post-structuralist, the key to changing the world lies in the way we use language to communicate and how we use language to relate to one another. So how do I speak to you? How do I communicate with you in a way that allows you to manifest yourself and your subjectivity? If, as Zakir, who is one of the pioneers of the migrant workers writing community here and an editor of the number of migrant worker anthologies, if, according to him, poetry is a platform for the expression of a subjectivity that exceeds the labor that the migrant worker provides, then how do we listen to, how do we respond to the work that allows the migrant to speak with a voice consciousness of their own? And how do I, as a critic and as a reader of the literature, how do I do my work without imposing on the other my impressions and my own biases? Now, apart from Irigaray, another thinker whose work on love has served as a guide of sorts for me is Alain Badiou, particularly his understanding of love as, and I quote, an existential project to construct a world from a decentered point of view, other than that of my mere impulse to survive or to reaffirm my own identity. Now, I think Badiou's work is particularly pertinent in the consideration of migrant writing, given that the metaphor of constructing a world is especially apt, considering Singapore as a city is built, constructed by migrant workers. What is poignant, however, is that often this labor of love goes unrecognized. As we will see later on, many migrant workers feel that they belong to the city, having helped build it, and yet are never made to feel welcome or made to feel deserving of the city's love. As Deirdre said, it is this feeling of the Unheimlich, of being a stranger in one's home, of being displaced. Now, this sense of the unhomely is also keenly felt by domestic migrant workers, and perhaps more so, who make their homes and lives with families here, taking on the role of caregivers to elderly members of families as well as children. They often feel a sense of the unhomely as well, bearing in mind too that a large number of them actually leave their own families and their own children, come here to love our families, our children, our parents, etc. Right? So as part of the family, and yet not quite fully family, these domestic workers find themselves oftentimes in the margins. Okay. So today, there are broadly three aspects of love in migrant worker writing that I would like to consider. The first one, how do we listen to the other? How do we respond to the other that preserves the voice consciousness of the other? So for this, I will mainly be referring to the anthology Call and Response. And this is an anthology of poetry that features both migrant and local poets in a sort of in the form of a call and a response, right? A sort of an exercise in trying to bridge migrant voices with local voices. So I thought that collection was particularly interesting, especially in consideration of Irigarei's work on, speaking to the other, relating to the other. The second aspect of love I want to consider is love in the form of exploitable labor, what the Norwegian feminist thinker Anna Jonas-Dottir refers to as love power. Women who come here are exploited for their love power, where love or their capacity to love is turned into a form of labor power. The third one is the relationship of the migrant worker with the city, presented in the image of the lover, right? This labor of love, as I said before, it is not exactly the same as love as a resource that's being exploited, but there is certainly a sense that the poet feels that there is some love that goes into his work, right? So it's not just labor, but there is feeling, there is bond, there is attachment to the city that he has helped to build as well. So these, broadly speaking, are the three aspects that I will be touching on today. But just to sort of give you an overview of types of migrants in Singapore. So this is all taken from an article by Sherwin Mendoza. And he says, the state of Singapore differentiates among migrants. Oh, I can't really see my own slide. Based on kinds of work, formal education, and salaries, distinguishing professionals, skilled workers, and semi-skilled workers. Non-Singaporeans in the first two categories can receive work passes, while semi-skilled workers can receive work permits. While those with passes have rights such as the ability to seek permanent residency, marry a local citizen, or bear a child in Singapore, those with permits, so these would include workers in the construction, manufacturing, shipyard processing or service sector, as well as confinement nannies, performing artists, and domestic workers, etc., are constructed by the state to provide a flexible workforce that can be admitted or expelled based on the needs of the Singaporean economy. Mendoza goes on to say the regulatory regime reduces migrant workers to an abstract equivalent, a worker on a work permit, thus denying the richness of their concrete subjectivity. So the migrant work permit indicates what the person is, right? As the work permit holder, one is identified as, one's identity is, for all intents and purposes, the labor power that one supplies. As a work permit holder, the migrant worker is reduced to a what? Yeah, merely the function that he or she serves. There is, however, if you look at the poetry and the writing, there is a desire to be seen as more than just the labor power that one can provide. That they have concrete experiences that exceed their labor. And one of these experiences, if you read the poetry, is that of love, which doesn't come easily for migrant workers here. So I'm sorry, this is a really, really huge sort of story. Yeah, it's a big slide. So I've just sort of highlighted the important bits that I'll be referring to, so you can sort of refer to that. So I was fortunate enough to be able to speak to Ria Mack, whose pen name is Ia. and whose story on forbidden love is the one that I referred to in the abstract. Now, Ria's story raises important questions about the subjectivity of the migrant worker in Singapore, specifically in relation to love. So in her piece, in this chapter, she talks about a desire to express her love for her partner in showing affection through gestures, right? Now, as a migrant worker, she isn't, however, free to do this. Her story is certainly one that reminds us of how limited the migrant worker subjectivity is, simply limited to the labor power that they provide. She mentions that there is also some form of anxiety on the part of employers that relationships might distract the migrant from her work. So the sense is that a migrant worker is only here to work, right? You're not here to do anything but work, okay? Now, what is ironic, of course, is that the love that migrant workers find so difficult to express, especially through gestures in public and things like that. Yeah, what is ironic is that love, the ability to form human bonds, to empathize, to live with the other, is ironically what they require of the migrant worker, especially domestic workers. In other words, the very thing that is difficult for the migrant worker to engage in publicly, forming bonds, affections through gesture and things like that, is the very thing that she is paid to perform when she works for a family, right? Which is to love. So this is reflected in a lot of the work we see written by female migrant workers who come here to do domestic work. Now, when I spoke to Ria, she revealed that she is a single mother of one. She came to Singapore to work so that she could provide for her child. So it is this love power. The idea of love power is, again, a concept that I borrowed from Jonas Dottier, that is exploited in order to keep these female migrant workers here. Now, Jonas Dottier explains that what lies at the root of the persistence of men's power over women is the male exploitation of what she calls love power, where love power is understood as, I quote, a creative and alienable practical human capacity used by people to act on one another's and one's own human material, mind, and body. So love as a creative and productive power that can be used to transform others, but also to transform oneself. So for Jonas Dottier, she says that love is significant as a transformative power sui generis in social life. And like labor, it is enjoyable, it is usable for liberation, as well as exploitable for dominance by some over others. Now, in Jonas Dottier's work, she has limited her use of love power or her understanding of love power to examining gender relations, right? The persistence of men's authority over women. But I think there's definitely something there that can be said about how society, well, Singapore, the economy, also exploits women's love power in order to maintain, I suppose, a kind of a class hierarchy as well. Yeah. So I think just looking at some of the poetry and the ways in which female domestic workers here talk about their relationship with the families, right, that they work for, I think Jonas Dottier's theory of love power can be extended to apply to the situation of foreign domestic workers as well. So in this situation, love becomes a form of labor power where foreign domestic workers leave their families, including their own children behind, in order to come over to care for our families, including our children. So this is demonstrated in the following poem by Nora Grimaldo. So she says, every teardrop on my eyes, my heart breaking up into pieces, you will go again on a faraway distance, leave me behind, nowhere to go, confusing my mind, stand on my own, fight for more. You trust me a lot, guard your house, look after your kids, while both of you are away. It means a lot in a short period of time. I care a lot. When you will go again, nowhere to go, my feeling is the whole world will crust like an ice melting so fast. Independent to run the household and look for the little ones while both parents are overseas, right? So from those lines alone, we get a sense that the speaker here comes to play the role of the parent, right? In the absence of the parents, the speaker steps in to care for the little ones, to run the household. You're happy to see them healthy and happy without any harm. Now the time has come. Saying goodbye is painful. Skilled and professional ones are almost the same in the helper. Transfer here, relocate there. You will face the challenges, start the new beginning. Even contracts never end. Otherwise, you will pay your own bond if you will not quit your job. No choice. You need to go back to your country, find jobs suitable for me. This is what we call the reality of our journey. So the poem that's placed next to it is, so this pair of poems is taken from the anthology I was talking about just now in my introduction, Call and Response. So this is The Call by Nora, who is a Filipina. She works as a foreign domestic worker here. And this is Stephanie Chan's response to Nora's poem. Stephanie is a local poet. So I think the part that I just wanted to draw our attention to is this bit here. Because women in Singapore never left the kitchen, the nursery, they just traded names and nationalities. So women in Singapore now have the choice to exploit or be exploited, but don't try to explain this, how this is all interconnected, how you owe your life to her and 24 other women from different countries whose names you don't recall, who passed in and out of your kitchen. Today, bite your tongue, nod your head, and listen. So I think this is a really powerful pair, right, of poems placed next to one another, because Stephanie here is responding in a way to some of the things that the issues brought up by Nora, right? It reveals, Stephanie's response here reveals the interconnectedness of the women, that in order for one woman, the local woman in Singapore, to be free from having her love power exploited, yeah, to be free from exploitation, she has to exploit another woman, right? Now, this response is interesting because it builds on the previous one and demonstrates the interconnectedness of the foreign and the local. Yeah. So examining expressions of love by migrant domestic workers allows us to expand Jonas Dautier's understanding of love power and its exploitation towards upholding existing gender hierarchy and reproducing patriarchy. As seen, it can also be applied towards examining the ways in which class relations intersect with gender relations and how the gender hierarchy and class hierarchy mutually support one another. I think there's definitely potential here in examining love, specifically love as a resource that can be exploited, that is exploited, not can be, but is. So this is another pair of poems by Ellie Noor Fadila. So, and Ellie is someone I had the opportunity to interview as well. So Ellie's poems express the pain of a mother having to leave her child. Ellie is also the mother of, she is a single mother, and she has also left her child in Indonesia in order to come to Singapore to earn a living, to provide for her child. So her experience is not unique, and this is often the case for a lot of domestic workers. Ellie has also told me that she experienced a sense of shame in Indonesia because she was a single mother. And one of the reasons why she wanted to come to Singapore was so that she could prove to her family that she could survive and make good and do something for her child, right? And I think what's really interesting and important here is that these are all, you know, aspects of the self, yeah, of her agency that goes unrecognized or unacknowledged when someone like Ellie is simply seen as a migrant worker. You know, the sort of the pain and the suffering that is very evident in her poetry, right? So, oh, time always passes so quickly. So although male migrant workers also express a love for family that's left behind and a desire to love and be loved, their capacity for love is not exploited in the same way as that of women. Now, interestingly, expressions of love by male writers and poets towards Singapore are common, and they're linked to the work and labor that they put into building the nation. So this is Mohar, a poet from Bangladesh, And he writes about this in his poem, and he refers to himself as a mad city lover. So I'm going to do a new share, and I'm going to go to this. No, that is not right. This one here. And I'm going to share the screen, and it is going to play because it will work out. And I know it will. And I will play this, and it will be this, and you should all be able to see. Is it working?
হ্যাঁ, একটা তো অবশ্যই লাগে, কিন্তু আমি একা নই, সাথে আছে কলম, প্রতিটি লাইন, শব্দ, অথেন্ট হেড। রাইট অর নট? রাইট, রাইট, রাইট অর নট? Stars rising over the stormy sea. Stars rising, rising. वहाँ पे फैमिली में रहना, यहाँ पे अकेले रहना, अकेले खाना, अकेले सोना, वो
how you shower, how you sleep is all is different like at the kampung.
在我们来到新加坡之后，我们首先要获得一个工作认证。
पासपोर्ट पे वही मोहर लग जाती है, सभी लोग उन्हें एक वर्कर की नजर से ही देखते हैं।
Yeah. 5 years working here, I only talk to my son I think 20 times.
我最想念的家乡的是应该是我的父母。
कभी-कभी ऐसे फील होता है कि क्यों आए और
No choice, I still want to work.
5 stars are rising, rising, 5 stars are rising, rising, 5 stars are rising over the stormy sea. 5 stars are rising, rising, 5 stars are rising. আমি মোর খান, আমি 2007-এ বাংলাদেশ থেকে সিঙ্গাপুর আসি। আমার কাজের সাইট কনস্ট্রাকশন। আমি বাংলা কণ্ঠ নিউজ পেপারে আমি নিয়মিত লিখি। আমি লেখালেখি পছন্দ করি। দিনের পর দিন শ্রম বরণে এই শহরের প্রতিটি স্তরে আমার ঘামের গণনা গন্ধ। তাই আজ আমি উম্মাদি এক শহর পেন। আমি গান দিচ্ছি, ছড়ম দিচ্ছি, অর্থ নিচ্ছি। এর ভিতরে যে এই শহর প্রেমী হয়ে গেছে, আমি শহর পাগল। এই দেশকে আমার মনে আমার নিজের দেশ মনে হয়। সিঙ্গাপুর যারা শ্রমিক।
Okay, so I'm going to stop there because there isn't really much time, and then I'm going to go back to new share, and I'm going to go back to my slides because it will work, and I'm back to my slides, and it's all good. Yeah, so the sort of sentiments expressed by Mohar in that particular clip, that is actually quite a common sentiment when you read sort of migrant worker poetry and stories, particularly of male migrant workers. You know, the idea that they present themselves or they use the metaphor of the lover, yeah, the active agent who has contributed to the building of the sort of the city, you know, whose work is really a labor of love. Yeah. So I guess, you know, I think there is definitely something to be said there when you compare in terms of looking at love. Yeah. So gendered expressions of love in sort of female migrant work and male migrant work, and how love presents itself, I guess, in sort of different ways, but always related to labor. You know, there's always that sense that it all comes back to labor. Okay, so sort of moving on. So the last aspect, and I'm sorry, so we sort of run out of time here. So the last aspect that I want to talk about is how the theme of love so bears, or rather how the practice of writing bears out the ethical possibilities offered by love, which I started out my paper with. I said at the start of my paper, referring to the work of Irigaray and Badu, that love can be understood as a way of responding also to the other, of relating to the other, being with the other in a way that preserves the subjectivity of the other and the difference of the other. So both Irigaray and Badu insist that in love, two must remain two. And it is this preservation of two-ness that I now want to turn my attention to, referring to some poems in the anthology of migrant writing called Call and Response. But before that, what I have here in this slide is just a brief history of the growth of migrant worker writing in Singapore. And you will notice that all of the organizations that have spearheaded and sort of formed, helped form or help with the growth and development of the migrant writing community are all NGOs. Okay, so I think it is important for us to understand, just to set a sort of a context, the place of the arts and writing in Singapore, the state of Singapore anyway. So we've been talking a lot about stories, and Singapore does have an official narrative. It's called the Singapore story. So this is the narrative of success, right? Of it being a small fishing village turned into a successful port, having been kicked out by Malaysia, thrust into independence in 1965. So the relationship between the artist and the state has always been filled with tension. It's quite a tenuous relationship. So for example, quite recently, Alfian Saad, who is a very vocal Malay poet, a gay Malay poet, had offered a course on political discourse in Singapore. The course was promptly shut down when he suggested for his students to sort of simulate, hold a demonstration. Demonstrations and lobbying, that's illegal in Singapore. But before him, Catherine Lim, another very, very established writer in Singapore, who was also a columnist for the Straits Times, once wrote an opinion piece that criticized the state, and she was also promptly shut down by the then Prime Minister, Goh Chok Tong, who said that the arts and politics should never mix. It was then that the OB markers, or the out-of-bound markers, were established for the arts, which sets limitations on what can and cannot be said. So generally speaking, anything criticizing the state is not allowed here. So with this in mind, then, it is not surprising that all the initiatives for promoting migrant writing here are taken on by NGOs. One can see this perhaps as a continuation of an already long-established history of the arts as offering a perspective that can serve as an alternative to the official Singapore narrative. So in the official Singapore story, the migrant worker's role is reduced to the labor that he or she provides. But in the poems and the stories that they tell, they become part of a culture that tells another story, one that the state does not necessarily acknowledge. Next slide. So this is Call and Response. It is a migrant/local poetry anthology. It was published in 2018. It was edited by Joshua Yip, who is a Singaporean, Rolinda and Zakir. Rolinda is here as she is she's now returned to the Philippines already, but she came here as a foreign domestic worker, and Zakir is still here as well. The objective of the collection was to create a sort of a bridge or a bond between migrant and local voices, and the structure, like the one I showed you of Nora's poem next to Stephanie, it is one poem by a migrant and one poem or a response by a local poet placed side by side. So Rolinda, who has also published a collection of poems of her own, she says, to me, this collaboration is a testament of equality and response on both sides, whether migrant or local. Migrants have always called for equality and respect, though these words may be blurred to some people. In the art of poetry, locals have responded with due respect and equality that migrants are clamoring for. For in the art of poetry, we are all equal in that we can give both a call and a response. It takes courage to call, it takes heart to respond. Zakir, whom I had the privilege to speak to, he's one of the editors of Call and Response. Zakir is also one of the most vocal and active migrant worker poets in Singapore. He is one of the pioneers of the migrant worker writing community here, and he's spearheaded many, many writing projects. Most recently, he called out the politician, the Minister of Manpower, for referring to migrant workers as brothers in his speech. So Zakir wrote in a Facebook post, he said, "Minister of Manpower, please do not call us your brothers. If we are truly your brothers, why do you surround us with riot squad and policemen?" So Zakir is, he's quite a vocal, he's quite a vocal figure. amongst the migrant worker writing community. So when we spoke, he explained to me the process of call and response. He and Rolinda collected writings from migrant workers and foreign domestic workers, and then they sent these works out to local writers, who then had the choice of picking which works they wanted to respond to. He explains that he wanted to give a collection of poems or writings that showed the bonding between the migrant and the local. And he had initially had the idea of naming the collection The Bonding, but they opted for call and response instead, which I thought was a pretty good idea. So this is a pair of poems, which I thought was really, really impactful. So the one on the left is written by Ria, whom I also had the opportunity to speak to. And the one on the right is written by Pooja Nancy. So Pooja's response to Ria's poem takes the form of a blackout poem. Right, so blackout poetry is basically a type of poetry that is created by taking written pieces of text from another part, like a book or a newspaper, in order to create your own poem. So it is a form of found poetry, meaning you select the words that catch your interest from another text, making sure they make sense, and from there you design a new poem. And after you're done with that, usually with a blackout marker, a black marker, as we see in Pooja's piece, you color the words that you don't need. So your poem sort of, it becomes a brand new story, I suppose, a brand new story to be created. So the idea here is to play with the existing text to create something of your own, but more importantly, to uncover new unspoken stories, sort of to read between the lines of the original text. Now, what I find really fascinating, I think it's quite significant that Pooja chose to create blackout poetry out of Ria's piece. Pooja, in the blackout piece, acknowledges that her poem is indebted to Ria's, right? And in that, she already acknowledges Ria's poem as being at the origins of her own work. Pooja's poem suggests that she is indebted to Ria's work, almost as though acknowledging, like Stephanie's response, both of them seem to be acknowledging the interconnectedness of women in Singapore and how the local woman, in order for her to work and earn a living, there must always be a migrant worker who steps in to do some of her work. Now, Pooja's poem also brings attention to the plight, not just of a single woman, because if you look at the ending of a poem, the speaker of the poem here ends with, "I am a foreign land," which suggests that the loneliness and solitude of the scarecrow is felt by an entire nation of women and not just a single woman. So we see that this is indeed the case, because oftentimes individuals get collectively lumped into the Filipina or the Bangladeshi. So just to sort of end, so this is a little bio of Ria. I'm so sorry, I don't have time to look at that. So this is another example. This one here is an anagrammatic ode, is an anagrammatic poem where Yo, the local poet, has used every single word of the original poem here to construct a new poem. And again, I think what's key about these two pairs of poems that I've picked out is that you sort of need the first poem in order to make sense of the second one. Because they're both found poems, the second poem of each pair cannot exist without the first. And I think it is this acknowledgement of the relation that is important here. These two poems, the one by Pooja and by Yo Kai Chai, both acknowledge in the form of their poems what the nation owes to our migrant workers. These two poems make a powerful statement about the way in which the official Singapore story tends to leave out the voices of the invisible hands that have helped to craft it, and that perhaps it is time for us to rewrite the narrative to allow these other voices to partake in its telling. I think that's the end of my presentation. I'm sorry it was so rushed, but I think I'm done. Stop sharing.